The air shattered with the deafening roar of heavy artillery as the earth erupted in fountains of dirt and debris. It was the first day of July in the year 1916, near the river Somme in France. Thousands of British soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in the narrow chalk trenches, waiting for the shrill sound of the whistle. Their hearts pounded against their ribs like trapped birds as they gripped their Lee-Enfield rifles with white-knuckled hands. The sky above was a chaotic tapestry of smoke and fire, blocking out the summer sun. This was the moment they had trained for, yet nothing could truly prepare a man for the inferno waiting just beyond the parapet. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity for the men lined up along the fire step. They checked their gas masks and tightened their webbing equipment in a nervous ritual. The bombardment that was supposed to destroy the German wire had fallen silent, leaving an eerie quiet that was more terrifying than the noise. Officers glanced at their wristwatches with grim determination, knowing that the lives of their men depended on precise timing. The air smelled of cordite and wet chalk mixed with the metallic tang of fear. In the distance, the German machine guns were already beginning to chatter a deadly rhythm that would define the day. The stakes could not have been higher for the British Expeditionary Force on that fateful morning. A breakthrough here was intended to relieve the immense pressure on the French army at Verdun and potentially end the war before another winter set in. Failure meant a prolonged war of attrition that would consume an entire generation of young men. The commanders believed that the artillery had done its work, but the soldiers in the front line could see the uncut wire tangled ominously in no man's land. If they failed to take the enemy trenches, they would be trapped in the open under a withering crossfire with no cover and no way back. Among the officers preparing to lead his men over the top was 2nd Lieutenant Siegfried Sassoon. He was a poet and a soldier who had already seen the grim reality of trench warfare, but this offensive was on a scale unlike anything before. Sassoon moved down the line, offering words of encouragement to the young privates who looked to him for reassurance. His uniform was stained with the clay of the trenches, and his eyes betrayed a deep weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He knew that many of the faces looking back at him would not live to see the sunset that evening. Siegfried Sassoon was not just a cog in the military machine, but a man deeply attuned to the suffering of his fellow soldiers. He had traded the comfortable life of a country gentleman for the squalor and terror of the Western Front. As he adjusted his Sam Brown belt and checked his Webley revolver, he felt the heavy burden of leadership. He was responsible for the lives of the men in his platoon, and that weight pressed down on him harder than the steel helmet on his head. He embodied the tragic duality of the war, a sensitive soul forced to participate in industrial slaughter. The whistle blew a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the tension like a knife. A roar went up from the British lines as wave after wave of men climbed ladders and scrambled over the sandbags. They advanced at a walking pace into the churned-up wasteland of craters and mud. The German machine gunners emerged from their deep dugouts and opened fire with devastating efficiency. Men fell in rows like wheat before a scythe, their bodies crumpling into the cratered earth. The carefully planned advance dissolved into chaos within minutes as units became mixed and officers were cut down leading the charge. Siegfried Sassoon moved forward with his men, urging them on despite the hail of bullets whizzing past. The ground was uneven and treacherous, making every step a struggle against the sucking mud. To his left and right he saw friends and comrades vanish into the smoke or fall silent in the grass. The noise was overwhelming, a cacophony of explosions and screams that drowned out all thought. Yet in the midst of this madness, he kept moving, driven by a primal instinct to survive and to complete the mission. The objective seemed impossibly far away across a landscape that looked more like the surface of the moon than the French countryside. The reality of life in the trenches was far more than just the terrifying moments of combat. For the vast majority of the war, the soldiers endured a monotonous and miserable existence defined by the elements. Rain was a constant enemy, turning the trench floors into rivers of thick, glutinous mud that reached the knees or even the waists of the men. This mud coated everything from uniforms to rifles and made simple movement an exhausting physical ordeal. It sucked the boots off feet and chilled the men to the bone, leading to the dreaded condition known as trench foot, which could cause flesh to rot. Rats were another ubiquitous plague that infested the trench systems in the millions. These rodents grew to enormous sizes, feeding on the scraps of food and the unburied dead. They scurried over the faces of sleeping soldiers and gnawed through canvas haversacks in search of biscuits. The men tried to hunt them with terriers or shoot them with pistols, but the rats always returned in greater numbers. They became a symbol of the degradation of trench life, a constant reminder that the soldiers were living in conditions unfit for animals, let alone human beings. Lice were an intimate and inescapable torment for every soldier on the Western Front. These tiny parasites lived in the seams of uniforms and laid their eggs in the fabric, causing intense itching and discomfort. The soldiers called them chats and spent their precious free time chatting or picking the lice out of their clothes by the light of a candle. Despite regular delousing stations and baths behind the lines, the lice always returned as soon as the men went back to the front. They were also carriers of trench fever, a debilitating illness that laid many men low with high fevers and severe pain. The daily diet of the frontline soldier was repetitive and often unappetizing, consisting mainly of bully beef and hardtack biscuits. The beef came in tins and was often congealed fat, while the biscuits were so hard they could break teeth if not soaked in tea. Fresh vegetables and meat were rare luxuries that seldom made it up to the forward trenches. The cooks did their best with what they had, often making stews in large metal containers that tasted faintly of petrol. Tea was the lifeblood of the British Army, brewed strong and sweet, and served at every opportunity to warm the men and keep morale from collapsing. Water was a precious commodity and was often brought up to the front line in old petrol cans. The taste of fuel lingered in the water, making it foul to drink, but the men had no other choice. Thirst was a constant companion, especially during the hot summer months or during prolonged bombardments when supply lines were cut. Soldiers would sometimes risk their lives to crawl to a shell hole filled with rainwater, only to find it contaminated with gas or decaying matter. The lack of clean water contributed to dysentery and other stomach ailments that plagued the troops. Sleep was a luxury that was snatched in brief intervals between sentry duties and working parties. The men slept in dugouts carved into the side of the trench walls, often crowded together for warmth. These underground shelters were damp and smelled of unwashed bodies and damp wool. During heavy bombardments, the dugouts offered some protection, but a direct hit could bury everyone inside alive. The constant noise of artillery and the fear of a gas attack meant that deep restorative sleep was almost impossible. Soldiers learned to nap standing up or leaning against the trench wall. Sentry duty was one of the most nerve-wracking tasks a soldier had to perform, especially at night. Standing on the fire step and peering into the darkness of no man's land played tricks on the mind. Every shadow seemed to move, and every rustle of the wind sounded like an enemy patrol cutting the wire. The sentry had to remain perfectly still and alert for hours, knowing that the safety of the entire platoon rested on his vigilance. A moment of inattention could lead to a surprise raid that would result in death or capture for his comrades. The threat of snipers was a constant danger that forced men to keep their heads down at all times. German snipers were highly skilled and used telescopic sights to target anyone careless enough to show themselves above the parapet. They would wait for hours with infinite patience for a target to appear. A moment of carelessness to light a cigarette or look at the view could result in a bullet to the head. The soldiers learned to move with a crouch and to use periscopes to observe the enemy lines without exposing themselves to fire. Poison gas was the most feared weapon of the war, bringing a terrifying and silent death. The first sign was often a change in the smell of the air, followed by the sight of a greenish-yellow cloud drifting across the ground. The cry of gas, gas, gas would echo down the trench line, sending men scrambling for their respirators. Fumbling with the mask in a panic could be fatal, as the gas attacked the lungs and eyes, causing blindness and suffocation. The masks themselves were claustrophobic and made breathing difficult, adding to the terror of the attack. Mustard gas was particularly insidious, as it could linger in the soil and mud for days after an attack. It burned the skin upon contact, causing massive blisters and temporary blindness. Soldiers who survived a gas attack were often left with permanent respiratory problems and psychological scars. The sight of lines of blinded men holding onto each other for guidance became one of the most enduring and tragic images of the war. The use of chemical weapons added a new layer of horror to a conflict that had already surpassed all previous limits of brutality. The physical landscape of the Western Front was a testament to the destructive power of modern industrial warfare. Towns and villages were reduced to piles of rubble, and forests were blasted into splintered stumps. The constant shelling churned the earth until the drainage systems were destroyed, creating vast swamps. Landmarks that the soldiers used for navigation were obliterated, making it easy to get lost in the featureless wasteland. The destruction was so complete that nature itself seemed to have been erased, leaving only mud and death in its wake. Boredom was an unexpected enemy that the soldiers had to contend with during the long periods of stalemate. When not involved in an attack or defense, there were endless hours of waiting and routine. Men wrote letters home, played cards, or carved intricate designs into chalk or shell casings to pass the time. This trench art became a way to maintain sanity and express creativity in a world devoid of beauty. The arrival of mail from home was the highlight of the week, providing a vital connection to the civilian life they had left behind. The bond between the soldiers became the strongest force keeping them going amidst the horror. Living in such close proximity and sharing every hardship created a brotherhood that was deeper than blood. They looked out for one another, shared their meager rations, and comforted each other in moments of despair. This camaraderie was often the only thing that stood between a man and a complete mental breakdown. The loss of a friend was a devastating blow that left a hole in the unit that could never be filled by a reinforcement. Working parties were sent out at night to repair the barbed wire defenses and shore up the trench walls. These missions were perilous as they took place in no man's land under the nose of the enemy. The men worked in silence, communicating with hand signals to avoid attracting attention. A sudden flare shot up by the enemy would illuminate the area with a stark white light, forcing everyone to freeze instantly. Being caught in the open by a machine gun while tangled in wire was a nightmare scenario that every soldier dreaded. The medical treatment available to the wounded was primitive by modern standards and often overwhelmed by the scale of casualties. Stretcher bearers worked tirelessly to carry the injured through the mud to the regimental aid posts. The journey was agonizing for men with shattered limbs or abdominal wounds. At the casualty clearing stations, surgeons worked around the clock performing amputations to prevent gangrene. Antibiotics did not yet exist, so infection was a major killer, even for those who survived the initial trauma of their wounds. Shell shock was a condition that the medical establishment struggled to understand and often treated with suspicion. Men who had been exposed to prolonged bombardment would sometimes lose the ability to speak, walk, or control their bodies. They stared with vacant eyes and trembled uncontrollably, their minds shattered by the relentless stress. Initially, some commanders viewed this as cowardice, and some sufferers were even executed. Slowly, it became recognized as a legitimate psychological injury caused by the inhuman conditions of the war. Winter in the trenches brought a new set of miseries as temperatures dropped well below freezing. The mud froze into hard ridges that made walking difficult, and the water in canteens turned to ice. Soldiers huddled together for warmth and wrapped their feet in sandbags to prevent frostbite. Sentries had to be relieved frequently to prevent them from freezing to death at their posts. The cold was a pervasive enemy that sapped the energy and morale of the troops, making the war seem even more endless and futile. Communication between the front line and headquarters was notoriously difficult and unreliable. Telephone wires were frequently cut by artillery fire, leaving runners as the only option. These brave men had to sprint across open ground carrying messages, dodging bullets and shells. Many runners were killed or wounded before they could deliver their vital intelligence. Carrier pigeons were also used as a backup method, carrying tiny messages in canisters on their legs. The breakdown in communication often led to confusion and tragic errors during battles. The Royal Engineers played a crucial role in the trench war, digging tunnels under enemy lines to plant massive mines. This underground war was a terrifying game of cat and mouse fought in the dark, claustrophobic silence. Miners listened with stethoscopes for the sounds of enemy digging, knowing that if they were discovered, they would be blown up or buried alive. The detonation of a mine would signal the start of an attack, creating a massive crater and obliterating the enemy defenses in an instant. Aerial warfare was a new development that added a vertical dimension to the conflict above the trenches. Soldiers would watch the dogfights between biplanes with a mixture of awe and fear. These knights of the air seemed to fight a cleaner war, but they also strafed the trenches and dropped bombs. Observation balloons tethered behind the lines directed artillery fire with deadly accuracy. The sight of an enemy plane overhead meant that a bombardment was likely to follow, forcing everyone to seek cover immediately. Tanks made their debut during the Battle of the Somme as terrifying metal monsters designed to cross trenches and crush wire. Early tanks were unreliable and often broke down or became stuck in the deep mud. The conditions inside were hellish, with fumes and heat choking the crew. Despite their flaws, the sight of a tank lumbering toward the enemy lines boosted the morale of the infantry. They represented a hope that technology might finally break the deadlock of the trenches and restore movement to the war. Religion and superstition played a significant role in the lives of many soldiers facing daily death. Chaplains held services in the support lines, offering communion and comfort to the men. Many soldiers carried lucky charms or Bibles in their breast pockets, hoping for divine protection. Tales of angels or ghostly figures intervening in battle spread through the ranks. In the face of random and industrialized death, faith provided a framework for understanding the chaos and a hope for something beyond the mud. Leave was a rare and cherished event that allowed a soldier to return to England for a few days. The transition from the hell of the trenches to the quiet streets of London or a country village was jarring. Soldiers often felt like strangers in their own homes, unable to explain what they had seen to their families. The silence of the countryside felt wrong after the constant noise of the front. Returning to the train station to go back to France was a heartbreaking moment of saying goodbye, perhaps for the last time. The German soldiers in the opposing trenches were often just yards away and endured the same miserable conditions. In some sectors, an informal truce would develop where neither side fired during breakfast or while retrieving the wounded. The famous Christmas truce of 1914 saw soldiers meeting in no man's land to exchange gifts and play football. However, as the war dragged on and the bitterness deepened, such moments of humanity became increasingly rare. The enemy remained a faceless threat to be destroyed. Discipline in the British Army was strict and maintained through a rigid hierarchy and the threat of punishment. Minor offenses could result in field punishment number 1, where a soldier was tied to a wagon wheel for hours. Desertion or cowardice in the face of the enemy carried the ultimate penalty of death by firing squad. These executions were carried out by the man's own comrades, leaving a stain of guilt and trauma on the unit. The harsh discipline was deemed necessary to force men to endure the unendurable. The role of junior officers like Siegfried Sassoon was particularly dangerous, as they were expected to lead from the front. The life expectancy of a subaltern on the Western Front was measured in weeks. They had to censor the letters of their men, bearing witness to the personal tragedies and hopes of the soldiers. The officer had to maintain a facade of confidence and cheerfulness, even when he was just as terrified as the men he led. This emotional labor took a heavy toll, leading many to break down. As the years passed, the composition of the army changed from the enthusiastic volunteers of 1914 to conscripts. The initial patriotic fervor was replaced by a grim determination to see the job through. The soldiers of 1918 were hardened veterans who had learned the tricks of survival. They were cynical about the promises of politicians and generals, but loyal to their mates. The war had become a job, a bloody and terrible job that had to be finished so they could go home. The question that haunted every soldier as he sat in the mud was whether the war would ever end. It seemed to have a momentum of its own, consuming men and material with an insatiable appetite. Would the line ever move, or would they be stuck in these ditches forever? The initial belief that it would be over by Christmas had become a bitter joke. They wondered if civilization itself was collapsing, and if the world they knew had already been destroyed. The future seemed like a dark void. The reveal of the answer came slowly, not with a single decisive battle, but with the exhaustion of the German war machine. The arrival of American troops and the failure of the German Spring Offensive in 1918 turned the tide. The Allied armies began to advance, pushing the enemy back across the devastated landscape. When the armistice was finally signed on the 11th of November, the silence that fell over the front was more shocking than the noise of battle. The guns stopped and the killing finally ceased. The immediate aftermath was a strange mix of relief and emptiness for the survivors. They had won, but the cost was staggering, with millions dead and a continent in ruins. The men who climbed out of the trenches for the last time were not the same as those who had gone in. They carried invisible wounds that would last a lifetime. The world they returned to was forever changed, and they were a lost generation trying to find their place in it. The trenches were filled in, but the scars on the earth and the soul remained. Siegfried Sassoon survived the war, but he never truly left the Western Front behind. His poetry and prose became a powerful testament to the suffering of the soldiers and the futility of the conflict. He spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of the horror he had witnessed. The trenches had forged him into a voice for the voiceless, ensuring that the sacrifice of his men would not be forgotten. His words continue to echo down the years, a whisper of time from the mud of the Somme. The Great War demonstrated the terrifying capacity of humanity to destroy itself with industrial efficiency. The trenches remain the ultimate symbol of this folly, a place where courage and depravity existed side by side. We must remember the soldiers not just as black and white figures in history books, but as flesh and blood men who lived and died in the mud. Their experience serves as a grim warning of the cost of war. As the last veterans have now passed away, it is our duty to keep their memory alive, lest we repeat their mistakes.